The invention of transistors made up of semiconductors was one of the world's largest technological steps forward in the 20th century. Instead of utilizing bulky, unreliable, and inefficient vacuum tubes, computers could now be much more compact and use less power. It was a massive discovery, and mankind may be on the verge of making the next similar leap with the potential discovery of a room temperature superconductor. A team out of Korea University in Seoul, South Korea, released a paper detailing the creation of a room temperature, ambient pressure superconducting material. Actually, they released multiple papers amidst quite a bit of controversy and drama that we're going to be getting to later. But as soon as the claim was made public, teams around the world got to work trying to replicate the results. The method for producing the material described in the papers was straightforward, so attempts were made by teams at major universities and research laboratories, as well as some guy streaming the entire process on Twitch and a Soviet cat girl who tried to reproduce LK-99 in her kitchen. At the time of writing, it's been just over a week since the initial announcement, and that makes me realize how far behind I am on recording this video, so the jury is still out on whether or not this superconductor is the real deal. But let's take a look at what it would mean if it is real, why the scientific community is so skeptical, and the reproduction attempts thus far. Now, the significance of a room temperature ambient pressure superconductor cannot possibly be overstated. Superconductors were first discovered in 1911 by Heike Kamerlin Onnes, and he was studying the electrical resistance of solid mercury at cryogenic temperatures, because why not, apparently. He noticed that at 4.2 Kelvin, the resistance suddenly dropped to 0. In the years that followed, other materials were found to be superconductive at slightly higher temperatures, such as lead at 7 Kelvin and niobium nitride at 16 Kelvin. Even once so-called high-temperature superconductors were discovered, they originally only operated at temperatures of 35 to 70 Kelvin. Until 2019, the highest temperature superconductor was only usable at temperatures up to 138 Kelvin. Then it was discovered that lanthanum hydride was superconductive at 250 Kelvin, which, by the way, is still minus 23 degrees Celsius. But the increased temperatures changed the cooling requirements from liquid helium to liquid nitrogen to really just a cold freezer. Each of those jumps made it substantially less expensive than the previous cooling requirements, but there was a caveat. In order for lanthanum hydride to be superconductive at 250 Kelvin, it had to be placed under a pressure of 170 gigapascals. That's the same amount of pressure you'll find in the Earth's outer core. But regardless of the temperature or pressure requirements, one of the important traits that all that superconductive material showed is a sharp and sudden drop to zero resistance. While it was shocking in 1911, this actually makes a lot of sense. It's similar to the other abrupt transition changes that we see in matter. At exactly 0 degrees Celsius, water droplets turn into ice crystals. There's not some nebulous middle ground where the molecules are only partially criticized. It is a sudden change. The other important trait, besides the sudden drop to zero resistance, is that superconductors expel their magnetic fields. This is called the Meissner effect, and it is the easiest way to tell visually if something has superconductive properties, as the material will repel magnets, thus allowing them to levitate. And if a substance like this were able to exist in normal everyday conditions, it would change the world. The biggest and most obvious changes would be in the powering of infrastructure. It could be the missing piece required to finally make fusion generators commercially viable after only 70 years of being just 20 years away. But even without fusion generators, our existing power would become much more efficient. Power lines are typically made of aluminium or copper, which have very low resistance, but that resistance is not zero, and as electrons pass through the conductive materials, some make contact with its atoms. This causes friction, which makes them lose energy by releasing heat. Not only is this why your phone or computer heats up when you use them, but it causes a significant amount of energy loss in the transmission of power. It's estimated that at least 5% of all energy generated and transmitted in the United States is lost as a result of this, totaling about $50 billion worth of energy every year. Not only would energy transmission be more efficient, but electronics built with superconductors would no longer heat up. This would make them run faster and more efficiently, and they could handle greater processing loads without any concerns of overheating. Battery life would also be greatly improved, as batteries would no longer be heating up and losing energy. Maglev trains would become much faster and likely much more popular as well. MRI machines, which rely on superconductors, would become smaller, cheaper, and possibly even portable. Quantum computers would be dramatically cheaper to produce and operate, allowing for huge leaps forward in quantum computing. And of course, you could finally have your goddamn hoverboards and flying cars. They'd still be and you wouldn't want them, but they'd definitely be possible. But as with all things, there has to be a major caveat with all of this. All of those things and more would be possible with the discovery of a room temperature superconductor, but they might not be possible with this particular superconductor. High-temperature superconductors tend to be ceramics rather than metals, which is the case with LK-99 as well. From a chemistry standpoint, two of the important defining characteristics of ceramics are that they are brittle and have low ductility. Ductility is how easy it is for something to be drawn out into a thin wire. Now, ceramic superconductors are still far from useless, but those two qualities limit many of the potential applications. If LK-99 really is a superconductor, the discovery may merely be mind-blowing rather than civilization-altering. So, the big question is it really a superconductor? Now, LK-99 gets the LK in its name from the two lead researchers, Seok-Bae Lee and Ji-Hoon Kim. The 99 comes from the year 1999, which is allegedly when they first began studying this material. It is a mixture of lead, copper, phosphorus, and oxygen that is usually described as lead apatate doped with copper. The whole thing is ground up with a mortar and pestle, then cooked at 925 degrees Celsius for 5 to 20 hours. It's a very simple process, which is why so many teams got to work immediately trying to replicate the substance. An initial paper regarding LK-99 was submitted to the peer-reviewed journal Nature in 2020, but it was rejected because they had already published a different claim of a room temperature superconductor just a few months prior, and the previous paper was receiving a lot of backlash and skepticism. That same year, Lee and Kim filed their first patent application, with another patent being filed in 2021 that included Young Wang Kwon's name on the application as well. Now, fast forward to March of 2023, and a paper was submitted to the Korean Journal of Crystal Growth and Crystal Technology. The Korean language paper failed to receive much attention until 3 months later, when one of the researchers made a bold decision. Kwon uploaded an English language paper to arXiv, listing Lee, Kim, and himself as authors. He had done this without permission of the other authors, and later that same day, Kim uploaded a second preprint of the research to arXiv that listed 6 authors in total, with Kwon's name not being one of them. Were the researchers fighting among themselves over who would get the credit and thus the Nobel Prize for this groundbreaking discovery? Well, it's possible, and it certainly seems like the intent had been for Kwon not to receive any credit. Days after he uploaded the first paper to arXiv, an official from Korea University said that Kwon was no longer working there. Lee added that not only had Kwon left the research team 4 months earlier, but the papers that were uploaded were incomplete and contained errors. This had been fairly obvious to anybody with an understanding of superconductors that read the papers, and it caused a lot of skepticism. arXiv is not peer-reviewed. It's an open-access website where anybody can upload their research. The papers on LK-99 seemed to be poorly written, contained unbalanced chemical equations, and overall didn't demonstrate the level of understanding of the compound that would be expected of a team that had been researching it for over 20 years. The original video that the team had published way back in February did little to help these concerns. It was meant to demonstrate the Meissner effect of LK-99, but they did so by using a copper-plated sample. This was a strange choice, as copper is diamagnetic. When a magnetic field is applied to diamagnetic materials, the materials create a magnetic field in the opposite direction. This causes them to be repelled by magnets rather than attracted to them, a visual feat similar to the Meissner effect. Though this is usually the first thing looked for when trying to observe if an object is a superconductor, by using copper plating in their demonstration, all the team showed was that the copper did what it was going to do anyway. But just because the original paper is incomplete or poorly written doesn't mean that the findings are actually wrong. The paper they submitted months earlier was written in Korean, so perhaps their English just isn't that good. It will likely be at least a few more weeks before we have anything resembling a definitive answer, though it didn't take long for theoretical and experimental results from other researchers to begin pouring in. Because the theoretical explanation for how or why LK-99 had superconductive properties was so incomplete in the original paper, the first peer studies that hit the internet were computer simulations designed to determine whether or not it was theoretically possible for the compound to be a superconductor. The first one was published on arXiv by Sinead Griffin out of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. According to her simulations, it was theoretically possible, which many people immediately jumped on as definitive proof that LK-99 was real. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Though simulations showed that the compound could possibly be a superconductor, it would almost certainly require being altered in some way during its production. Simply cooking the material at high temperature was unlikely to create the molecular lattice structure required to enable superconductivity. Other simulations found similar results, with scientists around the world saying that it may be possible with minor variations, such as doping lead apatite with gold instead of copper. The first experimental results came out of China shortly thereafter. Huazhong University of Science and Technology released a video of a tiny flake of LK-99 that allegedly seemed to be showing diamagnetic behavior. Unfortunately, the video was really terrible, and it's hard to make out what, if anything, is going on in it. The next report came out of Southeast University, and they reported measuring zero resistance in the substance. However, it still didn't behave as expected. Normally, superconductors have the sudden drop to zero resistance that we mentioned earlier, but that didn't happen in these experiments. There was an abrupt drop down at around 220 Kelvin, followed by a gradual decline to zero at 110 Kelvin or minus 163 Celsius. That's not the behavior that would be expected of a superconductor and is definitely not room temperature. But if this is true, it would still be a breakthrough, as it would be the highest temperature ambient pressure superconductor. These early experiments quickly came under fire for being too rushed, and nobody has been able to recreate these results. Subsequent testing has not been promising, as almost no other teams have found evidence of superconductivity or diamagnetism. The Korean scientists have fired back, saying that the materials they used were impure, or that they simply did it wrong. One of the few others to claim success was Iris Alexander, the soil scientist and Soviet cat girl who documented her reproduction attempt on Twitter. Though Iris only uploaded images rather than video, she showed her sample of LK-99 floating above a magnet to demonstrate the Meissner effect. Iris did not make claims about its conductivity, but she did specify that her sample was made using construction-grade phosphorus. This phosphorus is often contaminated with sulfur, which has led some to speculate that sulfur is the missing ingredient in the attempts to replicate the original substance. The Korean team did not claim any sulfur impurities in their formula, but we can't be sure yet, as they have stated that they won't let other scientists test pieces of their original sample until their paper has completed peer review. So, as we wait for the peer review process to play out, scientists around the world remain highly skeptical that LK-99 is the real deal. And why wouldn't they? There have been numerous false claims of room temperature superconductors, and if Nature hadn't rejected their paper in 2020, it could have been the second false claim of such in the same year. The shoddy and incomplete paper did little to boost anybody's confidence in the claims, even if that paper was an incomplete draft uploaded by a bitter ex-colleague. That's not to say the scientists don't want this to be true. They absolutely do. Room temperature superconductors would be such a massive breakthrough that, of course, they'd all be thrilled if someone were to discover one. But things aren't looking good right now. But perhaps attempts have been rushed so far, and either more deliberate attempts at replication or a more detailed description on the method of production from the original Korean team could see more promising results. Unfortunately, the prevailing opinion is that if LK-99 is anything, it's just diamagnetic and not superconductive. Diamagnetic materials are still cool, but it wouldn't be a breakthrough, as they're also extremely common. Even water is diamagnetic, which means that you are as well. This was demonstrated by Sir Andre Geim's 2000 Ig Nobel Prize-winning experiment when he used a strong magnetic field to make a frog levitate due to the diamagnetism of the water in its body. 10 years later, Geim introduced some much more practical research involving electromagnetism, and in 2010 he became the first and only person to date to have won both the Ig Nobel Prize and the actual Nobel Prize. But for Lee and Kim, a Nobel Prize for LK-99 thus far seems unlikely. Eventually, somebody is going to win one for a room temperature superconductor, but it probably isn't going to be this time.